The restaurant was buzzing with the chatter of customers, the clinking of silverware against plates, and the occasional laughter from groups enjoying their meals. It was a busy evening, and the waitstaff moved swiftly from table to table, taking orders and serving dishes. Among the guests was an elderly black woman who had walked in quietly, her posture dignified yet humble. She took a seat near the window and waited patiently for someone to take her order. Minutes passed, yet no one approached her table. She observed as other customers, who had arrived after her, were promptly attended to. A waiter, a young man with an air of arrogance, walked past her multiple times, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Finally, gathering her courage, she raised a hand to call him over. He sighed, rolling his eyes, and reluctantly stepped closer. "We're full," he said curtly. The woman glanced around. There were empty tables. "I just want to order a meal," she said kindly, but the waiter scoffed. "I don't think this is the right place for you," he muttered before turning away. A few customers nearby noticed the exchange, their expressions shifting with discomfort. The woman, unfazed, simply sat back in her chair. Moments later, a tall man in an expensive suit entered the restaurant. His commanding presence turned heads as he walked straight to the elderly woman's table. "Ma, I'm sorry I'm late," he said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He then turned toward the waiter, his gaze piercing. "Has anyone taken your order yet?" The waiter suddenly looked nervous. He had assumed the woman was alone. Before he could respond, the restaurant manager rushed over, his face pale. "Sir, it's an honor to have you here," the manager said hastily. The waiter frowned in confusion as he watched the manager extend a hand, which the well-dressed man ignored. Instead, he pulled out a business card and placed it on the table. The waiter's breath hitched as he read the name, one that was widely recognized in business and philanthropy circles. The man before him was a highly influential figure, a billionaire known for his contributions to society. "This is my mother," the man said, his voice cold and sharp. "The woman you refuse to serve." The waiter's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed, struggling for words, but none came. The manager stammered an apology, but the man wasn't interested. "I don't tolerate discrimination," he said firmly. "I'll make sure everyone knows how you treat people here." The elderly woman, however, placed a hand on her son's arm, her voice calm. "I don't need revenge," she said. "I just wanted a meal." Her words carried more weight than any reprimand. The restaurant fell into silence, the shame evident on the waiter's face. Without another word, the man helped his mother up, guiding her out the door. As they left, the waiter realized that in his ignorance, he had not just lost a customer, he had lost his dignity. As the mother and son walked out of the restaurant, the waiter remained frozen in place, his heart pounding. Whispers rippled through the other customers, and some shook their heads in disappointment. The manager, sensing the gravity of the situation, turned to the waiter with a scowl. "You just insulted one of the most powerful men in this city," the manager hissed. "And his mother, no less. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The waiter swallowed hard. He had made a terrible mistake, and now, it was too late to fix it. Outside, the elderly woman gently patted her son's arm. "Beta, don't hold on to anger," she said with a warm smile. "People like that waiter act out of ignorance, not wisdom." Her son exhaled deeply, still furious at the blatant discrimination his mother had faced. "Ma, you always choose kindness," he said, shaking his head. "But that doesn't mean they should get away with treating you like this." She chuckled softly. "I've lived long enough to know that revenge isn't the answer. But setting an example is." Just then, a young woman who had been dining in the restaurant ran up to them. "Excuse me, sir," she said breathlessly. "I saw what happened in there. I just wanted to say I admire how your mother handled it. She deserves so much more respect." The elderly woman smiled at the young lady, appreciating her words. The son nodded in gratitude before turning back to his mother. "Let's go somewhere that values you, Ma," he said. They got into the car, and as they drove off, his mind was already working. He had the power to bring real change, and he intended to. A few weeks later, that very restaurant was under fire. News had spread of the incident, and people began boycotting the place. The billionaire, without directly interfering, had simply shared the story of his mother's experience. The internet did the rest. The restaurant's reputation plummeted. Reviews flooded in, condemning the discriminatory treatment. Eventually, the owner had no choice but to take action. The manager and the waiter were both let go, and the restaurant issued a public apology. Meanwhile, the elderly woman continued to live her life with grace, never once speaking ill of the place or the people involved. She knew that true justice wasn't about seeing others fall, it was about ensuring that, in the future, no one else would be treated the way she had been. And in the end, her quiet dignity had changed more than just a single restaurant, it had sparked a conversation about respect, kindness, and the power of standing up for what is right. Months passed, and the incident slowly faded from the headlines, but its impact remained. The restaurant, struggling to recover from the bad press, underwent major changes. It came under new management, rebranded itself with a commitment to inclusivity, and even partnered with community organizations to promote diversity in the hospitality industry. Meanwhile, the billionaire's son never forgot what happened. Inspired by his mother's resilience, he decided to take things a step further. He launched an initiative aimed at training restaurant staff in cultural sensitivity and customer service, ensuring that no one would have to experience what his mother had. The program quickly gained traction, with several high-end restaurants signing up. It wasn't just about avoiding discrimination, it was about fostering genuine respect and understanding. One afternoon, the elderly woman was sitting in her garden, enjoying the fresh air, when her son approached her with a newspaper in hand. "Ma, look at this," he said with a smile, handing it to her. She adjusted her glasses and read the headline, "From Discrimination to Change, How One Woman's Grace Transformed an Industry." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I never wanted all this attention." Her son grinned. "You didn't need attention. You just needed to be yourself." And that was enough to inspire change. A few days later, the same restaurant where she had been humiliated reached out to invite her for a meal as an honored guest. The new management wanted to personally apologize and show her that they had learned from their mistakes. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she wanted to go back. But after some thought, she agreed. When she arrived, the atmosphere felt different. The new staff greeted her warmly, pulling out a chair for her with genuine respect. The waiter who had refused to serve her was no longer there, but in his place was a young woman who smiled brightly. "Welcome, ma'am," she said sincerely. "It's an honor to serve you today." The elderly woman glanced at her son, who gave her a knowing smile. She nodded and ordered her meal, this time not as someone invisible, but as someone truly valued. As she enjoyed her food, she realized that sometimes, change doesn't come from anger or revenge. It comes from holding your head high, standing firm in dignity, and letting the world see the power of kindness. As the elderly woman enjoyed her meal, a hush fell over the restaurant. Customers glanced over, some recognizing her from the news, while others simply sensed that something important was happening. The new manager approached hesitantly, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Ma'am," he began, his voice respectful, "I just want to say how deeply sorry we are for the way you were treated that day. There's no excuse for it." She looked up, her warm eyes studying him. "I appreciate your words, young man. But true change isn't in apologies, it's in actions." He nodded quickly. "I agree. That's why we've implemented new training programs, hired a more diverse staff, and committed to making this a place where everyone feels welcome. We hope you'll see the difference." She smiled gently. "I already do." As she and her son finished their meal, a familiar figure entered the restaurant, one that neither of them had expected. It was the waiter who had refused to serve her that fateful day. He looked different, less arrogant, more unsure of himself. Instead of the crisp uniform he had once worn, he was dressed casually, as if he had come from a long day of work elsewhere. He took a deep breath before stepping forward. "Ma'am, sir," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to say that I'm sorry. What I did was wrong, and I see that now. Losing my job made me reflect on a lot of things." The son's jaw tightened, memories of his mother's humiliation flashing in his mind. But before he could say anything, the elderly woman spoke first. "You learned a lesson," she said softly. "That's what matters." The waiter blinked, clearly surprised. "You're not angry?" She chuckled. "Anger is heavy. I don't have room for it in my heart." The former waiter lowered his gaze, ashamed yet grateful. "Thank you," he said simply before walking away. As the elderly woman and her son left the restaurant, the air felt lighter. She had come full circle, not just as a customer, but as someone who had helped spark real transformation. Outside, the son took a deep breath and turned to her. "Ma, you really are something else." She patted his arm with a knowing smile. "Beta, the world doesn't change with hate. It changes when people choose to be better." With that, they walked away, leaving behind more than just a restaurant. They left behind a lesson in grace, strength, and the quiet power of kindness. Days turned into weeks, and life carried on as usual. The elderly woman continued her simple, graceful routine, spending time with family, tending to her garden, and occasionally volunteering at a local community center. She never spoke much about the restaurant incident, nor did she dwell on it. For her, it was just another moment in a long life filled with both hardships and blessings. Her son, however, couldn't stop thinking about it. He had always admired his mother's wisdom, but seeing how her quiet dignity had transformed not just a restaurant but also the people involved filled him with a deeper sense of purpose. He realized that while he had built a life of wealth and influence, true impact came from changing hearts. One evening, as they sat on the veranda watching the sunset, he turned to her. "Ma, I've been thinking," he said. "What happened at that restaurant, it's not an isolated case. People face this kind of discrimination all the time, and not everyone has the power to walk away or make a difference like you did." She nodded knowingly but remained silent, letting him continue. "I want to do more," he said. "Not just for you, but for people like you, people who are overlooked, disrespected, and treated unfairly." She smiled. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I want to start something, a foundation," he said firmly. "A place that supports businesses committed to inclusivity, that helps train staff, that gives opportunities to those who've been shut out just because of their background, their age, or the color of their skin." The elderly woman studied him for a moment, then reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's a good thing, Beta. But do it with the right heart. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, do it because it's the right thing to do." He nodded. "Always, Ma." Within months, the foundation was launched. It started small, offering training programs for businesses and scholarships for young people from underprivileged communities who wanted to enter the hospitality industry. But as word spread, it grew rapidly. Large corporations took notice, and soon, his foundation was partnering with major brands to create a more inclusive world. The restaurant where it all started became one of the foundation's first certified partners. The new management ensured that their staff underwent diversity training, and they even introduced a Golden Table initiative, one reserved each week for elderly community members to dine for free, honoring their contributions to society. One day, the elderly woman received a letter. It was from the former waiter. "Ma'am, I wanted to write to you because I never got the chance to tell you how much you changed my life. After losing my job, I struggled, but it made me realize how blind I had been. Your kindness, when I least deserved it, made me want to be better. I've since gone back to school, and I'm now training to become a restaurant manager, one who treats everyone with respect. I owe that to you. Thank you for showing me grace. Tears welled up in her eyes as she folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer. She sat quietly for a moment, feeling a deep sense of peace. Her son, standing nearby, noticed her expression. Everything okay, Ma? She smiled, wiping the corner of her eye. Yes, Beta. Everything is just as it should be. And with that, she continued her evening, sipping her tea as the sun dipped below the horizon, knowing that sometimes, the most powerful change comes not from loud battles, but from quiet, unwavering grace. As time passed, the foundation flourished, touching lives in ways the elderly woman and her son had never imagined. More businesses adopted fair hiring practices, restaurants implemented training programs, and people who had once been overlooked found opportunities they had long been denied. One day, as the elderly woman sat on her veranda, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. She watched as her son stepped out, his expression warm but thoughtful. He carried a small envelope in his hand, something he often did when he had news to share. He kissed her forehead before taking a seat beside her. Ma, I have something for you. She chuckled. Another award? Beta, you know I don't need any of that. He grinned. No, this is different. He handed her the envelope, and she carefully opened it. Inside was an invitation, an official letter from the mayor's office. You are cordially invited as the guest of honor for the city's annual Diversity and Inclusion Gala, where we will be recognizing your invaluable contributions to fostering change and inspiring a more just society. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. Me? She asked, genuinely shocked. But I didn't do anything. Her son laughed. Ma, you did everything. You inspired this. All of it. If you hadn't handled that moment at the restaurant the way you did, none of this would have happened. She sighed, running her fingers over the elegant paper. I only did what I knew was right. That's all. And that, he said, is exactly why they want to honor you. The night of the gala arrived, and the venue was grand, chandeliers sparkling, people dressed in their finest attire, and an air of celebration filling the space. As the elderly woman entered, escorted by her son, the crowd erupted into applause. She blinked, startled by the attention, but her son squeezed her hand reassuringly. As she was led to the stage, the mayor himself welcomed her with a warm smile. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, tonight, we honor a woman whose quiet strength and unwavering grace have created ripples of change far beyond what she ever sought. Her story reminds us that dignity and kindness can transform even the coldest of hearts. Please welcome our guest of honor. The room rose to its feet. The elderly woman hesitated, then stepped up to the microphone. She cleared her throat and gazed out at the crowd, her wise eyes filled with humility. I don't have a speech prepared, she admitted, drawing soft laughter from the audience. I never expected to be standing here. I never wanted attention or recognition. I only wanted to be treated with respect, the way every human being deserves. She paused, taking a deep breath. What happened to me in that restaurant was not new. It has happened to others before me, and it still happens today. But what matters is how we choose to respond. I could have met cruelty with anger, but instead, I chose grace. Not because I am better than anyone else, but because I know that hate only breeds more hate. Kindness, on the other hand, kindness has the power to change hearts. The audience listened in silent admiration. So if I leave you with one thought tonight, let it be this, she continued. Treat people with the dignity they deserve, not because of who they are, but because of who you are. A beat of silence followed before the entire hall erupted into applause, louder than before. Her son, standing beside her, felt a lump in his throat as he watched his mother receive a standing ovation, not for being famous, not for being wealthy, but simply for being the kind of person the world needed more of. As the evening ended and they stepped outside into the cool night air, her son turned to her. Ma, I hope you know how proud I am of you. She patted his hand. And I hope you know how proud I am of you. A few weeks after the gala, life settled back into its usual rhythm. The elderly woman returned to her peaceful days, watering her plants, chatting with neighbors, and offering wisdom to those who sought it. Despite all the attention, she remained the same, never letting the recognition change her. One afternoon, as she was sitting on her veranda with a warm cup of tea, a knock came at the gate. She looked up to see a young man standing there, shifting nervously from foot to foot. She didn't recognize him at first, but as he stepped closer, realization dawned. It was the former waiter. His appearance had changed, his posture was more upright, his eyes less guarded, and his expression was one of quiet humility. He held a small brown envelope in his hands, gripping it tightly as if afraid to let go. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." She shook her head, offering him a gentle smile. "Not at all, Beta. Come, sit." He hesitated before stepping forward and taking a seat on the wooden bench across from her. For a moment, he simply stared down at the envelope, turning it over in his hands. I wanted to see you in person," he finally said. "After the letter I sent, I wasn't sure if I'd ever get the courage to face you again." She nodded, waiting patiently. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I got a job at a new restaurant, one that works with your son's foundation. They trained me in proper service, in respect, in treating every guest with dignity. And for the first time, I actually see people, not just customers." She smiled. "That's good to hear. There's more," he added, glancing up. "I was recently promoted to assistant manager." She raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's quite an achievement." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not just that. The owner asked me to recommend someone to lead the diversity training for new employees. And I told him, I want to do it. I want to be the one who teaches others what you taught me that day." The elderly woman's eyes softened. "That's a big responsibility." "I know," he said. "But if I can help even one person see the way I was wrong before, then maybe I can make things right." He finally placed the brown envelope on the table between them. "I saved my first paycheck from my new job, and I wanted to donate it to your son's foundation. It's not much, but—" She placed a wrinkled but steady hand over his, stopping him. "Beta," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "your real contribution isn't money. It's what you're doing with your life. You've already given more than enough." His eyes glistened, and he nodded, overcome with emotion. For the first time, he truly understood what she had meant that day: anger changes nothing, but grace. Grace changes everything. As he stood to leave, he hesitated, then surprised even himself by reaching forward and gently touching her feet in a respectful gesture. She smiled, placing a hand on his head in silent blessing. "Keep doing good," she said simply. "I will," he promised. As he walked away, the elderly woman leaned back in her chair, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. She took a slow sip of her tea, a peaceful smile on her lips. She had never sought to change the world. But somehow, simply by being herself, she had. As the days passed, the elderly woman continued with her simple, peaceful life. Though her story had spread far and wide, she remained unchanged, humble, kind, and content. Her son's foundation continued to grow, touching lives across the country, and more businesses embraced the values of respect and inclusivity. One evening, as she sat on her veranda watching the sunset, her son arrived with a thoughtful expression on his face. He sat beside her, holding a small leather-bound book. "Ma, do you ever think about your past?" he asked gently. She looked at him curiously. "Of course, Beta. Every wrinkle on my face holds a story." He smiled, flipping open the book. "I was thinking, your story, your wisdom, it shouldn't be forgotten. What if we write it down? Not just for me, but for everyone who could learn from you." She chuckled. "Who would want to read about an old woman's life?" He laughed. "Ma, everyone would. You have no idea how many people have been inspired by you. People who have faced discrimination, who have struggled, who have lost faith in kindness, they need to hear your story." She sighed, looking out at the fading sun. "I never did anything extraordinary, Beta. I just lived with dignity. And that," he said, placing the book in her lap, "is exactly why your story matters." She ran her fingers over the book's soft cover, deep in thought. She had never considered herself remarkable. She had simply done what she believed was right. But if her experiences could guide even one person toward kindness, perhaps it was worth sharing. She nodded slowly. "All right, Beta. Let's write." And so, night after night, they sat together on that veranda, turning memories into words. She spoke of her childhood, of lessons learned through struggle, of moments of pain and resilience. She recounted stories of kindness received and given, of how even the smallest acts of grace had the power to shape lives. Months later, the book was complete. When it was finally published, it became more than just a story, it became a beacon of hope for many. Readers from all walks of life found solace in her words, realizing that dignity and grace were not just ideals, but choices one could make every single day. One morning, as she sat with her tea, her son brought her the first printed copy. The title on the cover read, "Grace in the Face of Adversity, A Life of Quiet Strength." She smiled, running her fingers over the title before looking up at him. "I suppose my story belongs to the world now." He kissed her forehead. "It always did, Ma." As the years passed, her legacy continued, not just in the foundation, not just in the book, but in the countless lives she had touched. The restaurant where it all began kept her story alive, sharing it with every new staff member as a lesson in respect. The former waiter, now a respected manager, trained his employees with the same values she had once shown him. And her son, forever inspired, carried forward her teachings in everything he did. One day, long after she had left this world, a young girl picked up her book from a library shelf. She turned the pages with wonder, soaking in the words of a woman she had never met but whose wisdom felt like a warm embrace. And in that moment, the elderly woman's quiet grace lived on, whispering to yet another soul. "Kindness is the strongest power you will ever hold."